afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third roundtable of ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2022. This session is called International Relations and will explore the evolution of India-Pakistan diplomatic relations following their independence in 1947. It will also examine the complicated challenges of border movements of people and cattle, militancy, and mutual hostility. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate it if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback, please forward them via this chat to the chairperson. The questions will be consolidated for the speakers to answer later. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following distinguished speakers: Professor Ian Talbot, Emeritus Professor, History of Modern South Asia, University of Southampton, UK; Dr. Shrishti Sethi, Research Fellow, Lal Bahadur Shastri, National Academy of Administration, Mussoorie, India; and Dr. Hosna Shirley, Senior Researcher, Fulda University of Applied Sciences, Germany. I now invite Professor C. Raja Mohan, Distinguished Visiting Research Professor, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and Senior Fellow, Asia Society Policy Institute, New Delhi, to chair the session. Prof. Mohan, please.
Thank you, Vineek. It's really wonderful to be a part of this panel. But I must begin by congratulating the Institute of South Asian Studies for really organizing this set of roundtables on the 75th anniversary of Partition. I mean, looking at rupture and connectivity, and I think this is such an important topic, and somewhat, at least those of us who do IR, international relations, probably not enough focus on that. And on the ground, in India at least, the 75th anniversary has become a major political event, with a lot of the political leadership making it a moment of great celebration and triumphalism, if you will, and of sense of underlining India's achievements. I don't see much of similar thing in Pakistan at this point, at least. I mean, I could be wrong. But on both sides of the border, I mean, or in Bangladesh, I mean, there's not enough reflection on the partition, whose consequences are still out there, and we are dealing with them on a daily basis among the three countries. Although there is a rich expanding literature on the question of partition has emerged in the last many decades, the public discourse still there's not enough. I mean, on an anniversary like this, we thought we could at least have some reflection in the public square. There's not much of it, but I'm so glad at least ISAS is bringing together scholars to look at these issues. I would just draw attention to at least one book. Professor Tan Tayong, who is also the chairman of the ISAS, and Professor Kudesiak published a book many years ago, I mean, on the impact of partition on the subcontinent's many issues, I mean, which is migration, minorities, sharing of the two great river systems, and a whole range of issues that came out of partition. But I think since then there's a lot of work. But if you read the discourse on India-Pak relations or India-Bangladesh relations from a purely political science IR perspective, if you follow the India-Pak thing, it's all about nuclear, India-Pak, escalation, Kashmir. I mean, a kind of stuff that is completely disconnected from the histories of partition, and I think that's been a tragedy. But I hope the partition studies will help us really to put the study of IR and the nature of the international relations of the subcontinent in a more interesting and more enriching perspective. And this panel is going to look at the international relations. So I would say this really, really look forward to this panel. So three speakers, I mean, will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, maximum 15. I think 10 was the prescription. I think 12 to 15 would be wonderful. And that will give us at least 45 minutes after the presentations to have an audience Q&A. We seem to have a large audience, so I'm sure this will really be an exciting panel. So I really want to welcome the panelists and welcome all our participants for this session. So over to Professor Talbot.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much once again for the invitation to speak at the ISAS International Conference. I'm delighted to be able to participate, and particularly on the theme of the 75th anniversary of Partition, as much of my career has been taken up with writing about partition and its long-term legacies. I'm going to hopefully share the screen now and bring out, if I can, some slides relating to the topic. So I've moved on really to what I'm going to be talking about. The first slide was a map showing you the cities of Lahore and Amritsar and the Radcliffe Award, which ran between those two cities. The Radcliffe Award, of course, wasn't announced until 2 days after independence, and it drew the new boundary in the Punjab in terms of a border at the Wagah Canal, which really was equidistant between the two cities of Lahore and Amritsar. Those two cities were known as twin cities in the colonial period because of the close socio-economic and cultural connections between them, because they were only 45 miles apart. So they're very much there on the border and inevitably impacted by partition because of the vast movements of population that accompanied the partition. So the proximity of the cities make them, I think, a good case study for talking about the border and its impact. This slide here is a well-known portrayal, of course, of the border signifying sovereignty and the sort of nightly flag lowering at 0 point at the border at Wagah. And television portrayals mean that it's internationally known, so that it's become a place for tourists to see these displays of sovereignty. And in a way, this event, I think, symbolizes the division with the slamming of the gate nightly between the two countries. And it's quite effectively been called by Vrinda Kalra and Navtesh Puriwal in the study the strut of peacocks, because of course it's very much a theatrical presentation of sovereignty which goes on. However, the arguments I'm going to make in this presentation, which draws on my work Divided Cities, which was published in 2006, and which has been further developed by a former research student of mine, Ilyas Chatter, who's now based at Lums University in Pakistan, is that the border was much less hard than people assume it to have been in the decades after partition. Much of the literature on the partition borders always draw a distinction between the Bengal border, which is seen from the beginning as a porous border, and the Punjab border, which is seen much more as a hard border. And yet the reality was that there were still movements of people across that border, and movements of goods, smuggled goods, rather than formal trade. And the border, for some people who lived in the Lahore-Amritsar area, hardly seemed to exist for many years, and was often transgressed, if you want to use that terminology. The first point to make, I think, is that contraband goods were exchanged across the border and found their way into the Lahore and Amritsar marketplaces. And indeed, one could argue that the recovery of these two cities from the immediate trauma and upheaval of partition was very much the result of the availability of goods that came illegally across the border. And you can see, this is taken from Ilyas Chatter's book, The Punjab Borderland, and you can see the range of Indian goods that were available in the years after partition in the Lahore marketplaces. These are not traded formally, but these have arrived there through informal border crossings, and the Pakistani goods that were available in Amritsar marketplaces. And if you compare those two lists, you can begin to see some of the reasons for why this trade was so beneficial to the two cities, and also was quite vibrant. Goods which had previously been available in the twin cities and were commonplace became cut off by the formal border, but people still wanted, as consumers, some of these goods, so that they were smuggled across the border. And that raises the question, how could large amounts of illegal contraband be smuggled across the border, and why was it happening? Well, it was happening partly because there was the market for it, price differentials, or just lack of availability of goods were features. It happened with the connivance of local officials, border guards, customs officers, policemen. Migrants in Lahore wanted to have access to pan. This was something which they consumed normally before leaving what had become India. And the only way they could access it was through illegal smuggling. So that there is this sort of consumer preference of refugees for contraband goods, which creates a market for them. And indeed, the Pan Gali market in Lahore in the immediate post-independence period was one of the most thriving marketplaces. And some of the top operators in terms of the smuggling were people who were migrants. One of them, who was well known, had migrated from Amritsar to Lahore, maintained his long-term connections, trading connections, despite leaving the city, and used those connections to develop a trade between the two cities, which continued despite the formal introduction of the border. So what we're seeing here is local people almost behaving in terms of their consumer preferences as if this border was an artificial border that had been imposed, and that they still want, if they can, to have access to goods across the border. They rely on local people who know the terrain of the border and are easily able, particularly in the early decades of independence, to find routes which aren't policed. They rely on officials in both cities turning a blind eye to some of this activity in order to maintain it. But it shows you, I think, an important point of continuity rather than rupture. That overnight, people are not going to lose their consumer goods demand just because a border is there and it's difficult to send goods across it because of burdensome regulations. Why did official traders not trade in these goods? Well, some of them, of course, were like guns, for example, illegal anyway, but they were not wanting to engage in the regulatory framework. So they chose to do this through informal connections. However, it wasn't only smugglers who were behaving as if the border didn't exist. Here you can see, again, this is taken from Ilyas Chatter's book, which is based on police records at the border in terms of some of its primary source material. And he shows you how people who were arrested, and of course, this is the tip of the iceberg because many of the people who were crossing the border escaped arrest, but the people who were arrested, it shows you some of the motivations for why they might want to be crossing the border and to risk arrest. And you can see from these, I mean, Sadiq, for example, he wanted to watch Indian films. So that's why he crossed the border from Pakistan, and he was arrested on his way back. Obviously, things like cattle going astray over the border, we may hear more of this later, was a factor in trans-border sort of transgressions. But then people wanted to visit into Pakistan. This was before, of course, the formal arrangements for pilgrimage to Nankana. So people were crossing the border for that reason. For shopping, people were prepared to cross the border for shopping. And here you see a very similar situation to in Bengal, where people were commuting over the border and engaging in market activities, crossing the border for begging. 3 drunks, as is recorded in the police FIR at the border, were coming back to Pakistan after a night's stay with their Sikh mates. This tells you something about cross-community relations, because a lot of the partition literature is all about hatred, enmity, violence, upheaval, and here you see that the longer-term relationships are still there and intact. And I think that that's important to make us understand something about partition, which is often almost overlooked. It's true, of course, that the city's proximity to the border, when there were international tensions between India and Pakistan, did stop these kind of activities and indeed lead to panics and fear in both Amritsar and Lahore, even in the early 1950s. Whenever there was a deterioration in Indo-Pakistan relations, as for example at the time of the Hyderabad incident, when Indian troops entered Hyderabad, there was tension, and this stopped this sort of cross-border relationship. And indeed, there were movements of population, at least temporarily, away from the border area. A British observer reported thousands of Hindus pouring out of Amritsar by train and road at the time of the Hyderabad episode. And he carried on saying that whenever relations deteriorated, this was a fairly regular event, that people would leave the border area. There are also calls to arm the local population as well. In both Amritsar and Lahore, rifle clubs were established, and certainly there were women's military training in Lahore. In 1949, 1,600 girls paraded and engaged in rifle shooting. So that there is this sort of flip side of the continuing trade relations going on, in which international tensions spill over into how people on the border itself reacted. However, the Liaquat-Nehru Pact in April 1950 did introduce a new era, which lasted for a number of years in terms of cross-border activities. I'm going to talk in a minute, so I'll put the slide up about cricket, and cricket as a means of enabling the border to be formally opened. But before I do that, I just want to talk about other aspects of the way in which Lahore and Amritsar became symbolic of possible reconciliation and not disputed sites. Following the pact between Liaquat and Nehru, the pre-partition tradition of intercity rotary luncheon meetings between Lahore and Amritsar was re-established. On the 18th of June 1950, 30 Rotarians and their guests, including 6 ladies from Lahore, visited the Amritsar Club, and this was reciprocated. A few days later, Sheikh Abdul Malik, who was president of the Pakistan Punjab Traders Club, led a mission to Amritsar to try and get improved formal trade relations. And Nehru met this mission before they returned to Pakistan. And there was thereafter increased trade across the border, formal trade now we're talking about, not smuggling, and visits of people representing what we would now call civil society across the border. And all these border visits involve farewells and greetings at Wagah, followed by receptions in the border cities. And I think this gives an example of how the border cities were seen as possibly fulfilling a role of symbolizing reconciliation. You can see time's moving on, so I'm just going to very quickly talk about cricket diplomacy and the opening of the border. I think most people are probably aware of the cricket diplomacy in 2004-05. Perhaps what is less known is the cricket diplomacy in January and February 1955, when India and Pakistan played at the Baghi Jinnah in Lahore. This ground, as you can see from the photograph, was packed with 40,000 spectators, many of them accommodated in temporary seating. And during the course of the match, there were free access for Indians to visit Lahore. This access meant that some people didn't go at all to visit the cricket, but to try and see their former homes. During this time, according to reports in Dawn, 22,000 Indians visited Lahore in a 5-day period. There had to be 200 sort of buses that were laid on to take them from the Wagah border. There was also various reports of fraternization in Dawn. Dawn was obviously doing this for a purpose, but it was reporting nonetheless events that happened. So it reported that 200 Indian high school and college girls were entering Lahore and were walking around the city unescorted in small batches. This isn't that long after the partition violence in the direction of violence against women, something which partition studies has emphasized.
Professor Talbot, we must really wind up. It's almost 20 minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm just going to say one more thing and I'll wind up. I'm sorry I've gone on. The final point is that there was actually, during this time, a procession through the Mall, the main thoroughfare in Lahore, involving Hindus, Sikhs, and local Lahore Muslims, shouting slogans for friendship between India and Pakistan. And I think that this is a good point on which, and an optimistic point, to see how the border could be viewed differently perhaps than it is, to end my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you there.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, can I call on Dr. Sethi now?
Thank you, Professor Mohan. And it is obviously quite an honor to be, following up on what Professor Dorbert has just put across and put forth for us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It'll take a minute. Right, so once again, extending my gratitude to the AS International Conference on South Asia and the entire team that has kind of put this, roundtable together, focusing on a quintessential sort of aspect of South Asia, which is the partition of India and Pakistan, subsequently Bangladesh, back in 1947. And also taking up and reminding oneself what we had thought of the partition and what it ended up being are really two completely different sort of stories. Our then Prime Minister had reminded us that the partition was not part of the fundamentals at all. It was rather a passing phase of inconvenience, an issue to be managed that would have eventually been overshadowed, and development and integration would have taken place. And those were the, trying to just move this one, if you could just, yeah, perfect. So those were the thoughts about partition at the time, not envisaging the fact that several years later, we would have both socio-political implications around aspects of partition, across disciplines and fields of study. So just to remind ourselves, once again, these are sites from 47, one of the largest camps of refugees that had existed back in New Delhi, Kingsway Camp. And the image on the right-hand side is one of the fieldwork that I'd conducted earlier on. And they had remained in such informal settlements till about 2018. And in fact, I'll move on to images to show the current and contemporary spaces that the so-called illegal immigrants occupy, and the mobility patterns that take place. I am now kind of shifting focus specifically to Rajasthan, the western frontiers, particularly on the community of Pakistani Hindus and the phases that they have come into India in, which is the 1965 war, the 71 war, and the 1992 phase, which is where we've noticed a huge influx of this population into the border regions of Rajasthan. Again, looking at borders, one definitely understands the dynamic border and the dull border, which one may consider Punjab and Kashmir to be much talked about in conflicted spaces, and referred to as dynamic frontiers. So my attempt here was to, in fact, focus on the relatively dull frontier, so to speak of, where consistently mobility had taken place till the fences were drawn up in the 90s. And some of these excerpts were recorded in Jodhpur and Jaisalmer, Mohangarh area of the western region, where we realize how some families that were left behind at the time of partition and have worked as bonded laborers across feudal lords' lands and properties decided to literally walk across and plan escapes from one country to the other, eventually giving themselves up at the border police stations. And there are larger implications of the population that remained back, specifically in the Sindh province, as well as the southern Punjab province, where there were discussions around a smaller cohort working against the minority Hindus, particularly in a way of discrimination and conversions that were taking place in regions of Rahim Yar Khan, etc. Again, these estimates and data availability from the border remains a bit skewed, but we do know that the three phases have had enough impact on the state of Rajasthan, particularly along the border region, border districts, in fact. So what we really do realize is that we constantly have to juggle between these two aspects of the mainstream narrative as well as the peripheral narrative. Here, quite literally, the margins of a country where we think there's specific limitations that have been, put through effective militarization and securitization that has taken place, but they do serve as transitional zones because there is a group of people that still abide by a sense of belonging to the pre-partition era, which was, for example, Umarkot was still part of the Marwar region back in the day of the Rajputana kingdom. And the extension of Jodhpur, boundary line would in fact go into modern day Pakistan. Therefore, we see prior kinship relations as well as contemporary marriage ties that they come in across the border using train links or bus links to come in and choose kinship ties as well as marital relations. More contemporary imagery of the informal settlements of Pakistani Hindus who arrive in. They are both related to aspects of community. I apologize for some meeting that's coming. So yes, as I was saying, there are three phases of informal migrants who have arrived into Jodhpur. These are images from Jodhpur, and particularly the community, around 80% of the community members are Bhils or tribal members. The regional dialect and language that is used is That. It also reminds us of people who are displaced across phases of, migration that I had mentioned earlier, but the term of address that are used for different groups of people obviously keeps changing because we expect it to deliberate in a certain manner from the central government side and the state government directives. That overlap and that change really presents to us a peculiar challenge, which then says to us that there are nationality issues and citizenship challenges for different phases. So people who've arrived into the 7th phase have a different status of citizenship, and people who've arrived after 92 have a different status. And some within the same family grouping have got, different statuses attached to them, along with being Pakistani nationals and holding a Pakistani passport. So as I was saying, that they make their entry primarily into informal settlements of Jodhpur. There are about 6 or 7 of them located on the peripheries of the city, Kaliberi being one of the oldest one, which has migrants from all 3 phases. They make their way through the Bhagat Ki Koti train, which used to function every Saturday, through the Munabo Kokrapar region, as we were discussing earlier. And a lot of them come from the Thar Parkar district of Sindh. Yes, moving along, I think there are these aspects which we need to understand that this definitely is a remnant of the partition, a challenge which has been brought forth due to these, devoid understandings of the border and the restrictions that a land provides to its citizens. It is also a sense of, from the state's perspective, achieving a sort of ordering or management of spaces at the margins, which actually limits the region's, start and end point. And in that larger context, I think it's important to understand that there are parallel narratives that are running in these border regions, which again depend on what the state perspective is and what the democratic perspective is, which is generally of the populace that is undergoing this transformation as part of the larger migration and mobility that's taken place. So there are a lot of cartographic anxieties, notions of peaceful coexistence, and this, stabilizing and ordering, as I was saying, of the border regions or borderlands, as I insist and argue for. But at the same time, we see these spaces, which are spaces of religious synchronicity and hybridity for these Pakistani Hindus, who in fact use tourist visas as well as pilgrimage visas to visit back and forth. Upon reaching the Indian borderlands, they extend their visa limits and try and attempt to become naturalized citizens. So again, negotiating citizenship and belonging in the everyday and the effect that it has on their life worlds is something which is quite contradictory to the administrative layers that they have to realize and the paperwork that they have to do across 11 years of naturalization that is required of them. There were obviously several NGOs that were working with the communities of the so-called illegal migrants. They like to call themselves as a Pak minority migrant, since they see themselves as the Hindu community that was left behind at the time of partition in Pakistan. And this was from one of the public hearings that I had attended, back during the field work in Mohangarh in Jaisalmer. It is also, I think, important to mention the role of the localized administrative officers and the challenges one faces, because every family member is not registered with the FRO, which is the Foreign Registration Office. And that process really makes it challenging for the administration also to give them a sort of perspective and a sort of location identification. So across a family, there might be 8 or 10 people, out of which 2 have come in for a hospitalization and 2 have visited on a pilgrimage visa. But now the challenge of the local governance remains of providing, long-term assimilation and a citizenship, because these are families that have had their ancestral villages in spaces like Mohangarh, Jaisalmer, as well as Jodhpur. Just bearing in mind the time, I think, therefore, it's important to also understand how the so-called migrant emplacement in these urban borderlands affects our daily sort of governance, as well as developing narratives further, because we see the larger process of displacement that had taken place at the time of partition and similar patterns at a smaller scale taking place today. In fact, at the time of partition, we had a rehabilitation committee and relocation processes that were there in place. Today, in fact, we have ad hoc policies that are in place for specific groups of refugees or migrants that are going across the border. This is also an attempt where nation states need to understand the national identity and regional identity may vary, and how are we supposed to sort of enmesh the two and assimilate these people who had belonged on this side and became default citizens of Pakistan, in fact. I think it's also important to understand the role of this group, the Pakistani Hindus, who are primarily Bhils, and what role would they play in the urban regeneration of these borderland areas, especially when the Indian government is providing such a huge emphasis on border management in its national security agenda and policy. I believe it is an understanding historically that one has to develop and contribute back to our national security agenda as well. In fact, keeping in mind that the partition led to these communities becoming citizens of one side of the borderline or the other. And therefore, border cities finally need to come to the mainstream and not just remain on the margins of our discussion points. And therefore, I think relook at, maybe there are lessons from the rehabilitation and settlement framework that the partition committees had looked at. And some of the answers may lie in the history of South Asia. So yes, with that, I'm happy to answer some questions towards the end of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. That's so we now move on to the next speaker, Dr. Shuli here.
Thank you, Professor Mohan. So let me get some of my slides. So first of all, I would like to thank you, the ISS, for organizing this wonderful event and putting me into this roundtable. So today's presentation is part of a pilot research project that I'm currently conducting on memory, belonging, and identities and mobilities in the age of virtual connectivity, with particular interest in Bengal and Punjab, two kind of places that suffered the partition so much. It's basically a social media-based research on various Facebook pages and YouTube channels, and these pages have over like 100,000 members, run by Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis. So today, for the roundtable, I'm focusing on India-Pakistan connectivity and mobilities, and how people make their way out while geopolitical tensions affect their desired relations with ancestral places, people, and relatives. So I begin with a very short, brief ways of the fortified border between India and Pakistan. So many of you may have already know that India-Pakistan borders are separated by over 3,320 kilometers long fortified border, and the northern section that runs through the Kashmir region. The southern section has a kind of international border. The border basically discourages the almost all forms of mobilities, and it is very often conceptualized as a deadlock borders. That the border almost kind of blocks all forms of circulations, including people. It describes completely and almost completely sealed border, but it is also not very sealed, as we have seen from the previous two presentations. That there are localized natures of movements that are going through in various places, infiltration and other things. But the particular aspect of like the tourism and visiting families a bit further, which require legal perspectives and visas, that suffers a kind of quite a bit setback. There are initiatives, at least, to allow religious tourism as per the agreement between Pakistan and India, which reached in 1974. The pilgrims can visit religious sites of both the countries. So in connection to this, a train and bus services between Delhi and Lahore were launched, which couldn't continue longer because of the unstable bilateral relations. The most promising one is the Khatipur corridor, which is operating since 2019. So the corridor is a border crossing that connects two important Sikh shrines in India and Pakistan, and provide access for Sikh pilgrims from Indian Punjab to Pakistani Punjab. So it's a fully functioning visa-free secure border crossing where devotees from Indian side can visit the Pakistani side. And in addition to this, a new agreement between both the countries in this year offers direct flights for the pilgrims via Air India and Pakistan International Airlines as part of a boost to religious tourism for the first time in 75 years. So that, however, the success of each initiative, in fact, actually depends on the bilateral relations. So sometimes closed borders are tools to control mobilities, and sometimes they are used to gain votes or to put pressure on the neighboring country. So while it is theoretically possible to achieve various types of visas, obtaining visa is a kind of the real hard thing. Travel restrictions, visa regulations, and the absence of direct flight between both the countries make like the cross-border connectivity almost kind of non-existent for the ordinary people, other than very localized nature of connectivity. So in this connection, there are various social media connectivity where people are forming various platforms. People are from both the countries are joining as members. So aim of these social media groups to boost friendship, know people in other side of the border, and reestablishing kinship that broke like 75 years ago. So they often share like 50 to 150 posts each day on various topics, ranging from photos of historically significant places, discuss about food and restaurants, scenic tourist places, infrastructural developments, achievements in sports and education. So all these often represent nationalistic pride over resources, development, and achievements. This is very often praised by people of the other side of the border, but also bring contentious debates. Due to the low contact opportunities, the desire to learn more about each other and exchange ideas remains kind of largely unfulfilled, which has been actually encouraged with more general tendency within these groups is to learn more about the culture and heritage about the other side of the border. So the people share posts that include interest and curiosity over particular places, cities and groups, which offer a kind of virtual tourism. Or to see the kind of places, the ancestral locations. There are also the posts like people post frustrations and disappointments over bilateral relations and closed borders. So every day there are some posts that include their ultimate desire to visit ancestral city before their death. It's a kind of very common within these platforms. And the discussions are also dominated by partition stories. It's a very good place to get localized nature of oral histories of the partition, sharing images of the partition time artifacts, family belonging, religious places. So discussion often involve help posts like requests to send books from India to Pakistan, searching for lost relatives, pinpointing ancestors' house, translating letters, advice on places to be visited, how to get a visa, etc. So people share their trauma, their curiosity to know how the other side think about them. Interestingly, a majority of the posts very carefully try avoiding contentious topics or debates and try not to engage, not to hurt others. There are reflections like they make best friends with Indians in foreign countries when they do. Why do they fight when they are in countries? And often they praise the groups, for example, that it reminds me to set aside my historical prejudices and see each others are as human as we are. So there are also like sharing of frustrations about how they think about their countries are kind of similar. So there is like, for example, one quote, no need to visit in Pakistan. Both are these two sides of the same fake coin. Both are externally brutal to the poor, women and minorities. Once you reach Pakistan, you will still feel you are still in India. So some kind of shared frustrations are there, but at the same time, there are contentious debates too. So the discussions actually highlight various ground realities of barriers and practicalities in relation to various types of visas. For example, getting the pilgrimage visa is often tied to the numbers and the non-existence of tourist visa. And also some people want to visit their ancestors' places where they don't have any relatives, which requires some kind of documentation. So this shows the real ground problems for visiting others. There were proposals like student exchange programs, visa-free movements for people over 70s that also brings like humor and other things. So, however, everyone does not share the same feeling in these groups. So the political tensions that bar the tourism and connectivity appear in virtual spaces too. Very often discussion take a nationalistic line while an image or old temple or mosque is presented. Members compare how other side of the border taking care of minorities, religious places or icons. So the mood of the discussion often takes a very unexpected direction, just like the India-Pakistan official relations go. Here I'm sharing some of the posts for the ethical purpose. I'm not mentioning any names. So, for example, they are aware about how things are happening in other sides. So someone posted that there is a first Hindu woman becoming the senior cop in Pakistan that was there, and it raised discussions. There were posts like this. So someone who was looking for the place where their parents actually belonged and tried to put together some of the name of the places and asked other group members whether they could share information where these places were. So some people in the Pakistan side, they also try to pinpoint the place and then they share images. So there, this kind of the interaction and connections is quite common. And there was another interesting one is like a letter someone found which he couldn't translate. So one of the group member made a kind of audio call with translation of this letter. There are also like the media. So my mother loves watching Pakistani dramas. Now I'm addicted to how I find gems like these things and the other things. So it brings in the mundane life, but it also has some of the social media brought a recent very high profile trip of Reena Verma, who visited Pakistan, whose visa was denied initially, but after kind of several try of various Facebook groups and something that attracted to the ministers in Pakistan's eye, and then she got the visa to visit there. So it's not really materialized the real connection to visiting other sides of the border sometimes, but it creates this kind of space for these people to at least do some kind of connections, know each other. So how this connectivity powered by social media platform actually transcend the geopolitically charged closed border practices? Can these digital interactions and connectivity have the potential to alter various stereotypes? So what I found the most intriguing here is that the social media platform offer the kind of unique opportunities to the ordinary people to directly communicate with each other, not via anything else. So they share their mundane life, grief, partition trauma, and at the same time connect friends and families, at least virtually. So which the state elites often ignored in last kind of all these decades. So this is an opportunity to change some of the perceptions and attitudes about each other. And one of the special aspects of these groups is that the members try not to fight over geopolitically charged topics. The main ambition is to try to move on. So whenever a post intends to highlight similarities, many come up with differences they have and vice versa, yet common ground at least to kind of break the barriers and move on to live peacefully. However, it's also important to keep in mind that the admins of these groups are powerful actors who to some extent oversees what are being posted and what people write and often limit comments options. So it's not entirely free space that people can say whatever they like to say. But I think in an age of increasing state insecurity, some are coming together on their own to build friendship. They're making kind of connections across distance and difference, which kind of reflect a bit of altered geopolitics. The term as a reminder to look at the grassroots practices, to the ways they group or doing geopolitics on the social media, which also connect the streets, homes, and in many other spaces of the cage. Though they may not think of their work as geopolitics, but framing in this way can often open fruitful conversations. So they kind of try to reimagine the nexus of geopolitical and everyday to open up possibilities for ordinary lives, holding some kind of solutions to their problems, how emotions, and deploy the felt in geopolitical events. Although it's a new trend, however, members increase quite fast. But it is also a bit of like fragile because the social media platforms can, in a moment, can kind of remove the whole group, where they can lose all the connections they had. This happened with one of these groups, but they actually re-established this group and the membership increased quite high. So it's a kind of tension, but also a kind of hope. It's a kind of an opportunity, and it's a kind of watching new ways to re-establish and kind of continue friendship. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shulik. I think the three of you covered a vast set of issues. So let me ask the audience to start. I mean, there are a couple of questions, but I would like to see more questions come in. But before that, maybe I would just throw in one question each to the three speakers. First, to Dr. Talbot, you talked about the cities as sites of reconciliation. And I didn't know about the 1955 march, and I think we tracked that in the 2004, 2005, when people were willing to, host Indians who came across, keep them in their homes. Is there something similar? For example, I mean, you see, is it special to Punjab because there is a kind of ethnic commonality? Or do you see something similar, Karachi, Bombay, where the business communities were actually historically quite closely linked?
Yes, I think that obviously the cultural links in Punjab were very strong, especially in the rural areas. And I think that obviously all these cultural ties are there, as well as business ties across much of the subcontinent. The divide is not as deep as sometimes I think the stereotype produces. Obviously, the two states may be locked in conflict, but at a people-to-people level, the impression that I get, is that there is always a connection, and that there's a desire for that connection. I mean, people going to the Wagah border sometimes on sort of peace missions at a time of conflict between the two states. So I think it's there, but unfortunately, often this is overridden, by what's happening in the sort of international dimension between the states. But certainly, the impression that I've always had, is that whenever people do visit across the border in Punjab, particularly, they are warmly received. They realize that there's as much that unites as divides, if not more, and that is a feature, I think, of this long overhang, of the tragedy of partition.
And I wanted to ask Dr. Sethi, I mean, you mentioned the Hindu community and, the liminality, the difficulties and the challenges that they face. But how does the caste equations work across? Because the many communities, though there might be different religions, they still belong to same castes. And I've been told many times they would rather marry in the same caste among the Muslims or Hindus rather than in another caste of Hindus, of co-religionists. So did you see, because I remember, when there was an attempt at opening Lahore Amritsar border, there was a lot of demand from Manabao, Koprapar that you must have similar linkages open up. So is there another dimension merely than the religious one to what happens on the Rajasthan Sindh border?
Yes, no, absolutely. And it's such a sort of relevant interconnection, yet disjunct, in fact, if I may. Caste plays such an important role, even though it is an Islamic nation. We have Jati Hindus who've remained back, by choice or by default. But one of the main reasons for them to come across the border and take the risk of applying for visas and overstaying and visiting cities that they're not allowed to is primarily in the, for the primary reason of finding the appropriate groom or bride across the border, because they'd rather not marry the ones that are available on the wrong side of the border, so to speak. Umarkot is one such example. Southern Punjab, Bhagalpur. Some districts, you almost always know that there are, brides that are coming in from across the border, and therefore the challenge, which was so pronounced now in contemporary times, when both the bus service and the train links were restricted. We thought we were restricting, ties and things, but we know these deep family connections. And then the Bheels, of course, their entire sort of endogamous presence, they'd much rather come across the border and marry in their ancestral villages. In fact, come in for funerals as well. So once they come into Rajasthan and visit sites which are more localized and regional versions of religiosity, they'd much rather come here and, hold their final rites and funerals for the family members. So in fact, that plays a huge role in the cross-border mobility that has existed since partition, sir.
To Dr. Shuli, I mean, you mentioned a lot of the recent episodes. I mean, how, despite there is this national level, state level discourse, I mean, the same social media really spewing venom at each other. But there are communities within this, below that, where the local discourse, there's so much of shared, interests and common ground that is there when you refer to it. One of the recent things, I mean, I don't know, many of you would have followed the song Pasuri by Ali Sethi, and millions of, it became such a big hit in India. Of course, this is more of the Punjab kind of a thing. So I think there are, for all the negativity at the top, I mean, where the state-to-state discourse is so deeply securitized, so deeply militarized, and seemingly a hopeless situation that exists. There's been no talks, there's been no dialogue, and everything seems to be frozen. But there are constantly things that are happening. So this, on the geopolitical versus local as well. I mean, I think we've seen interesting stuff, like, for example, the World Punjabi Conference that took place 3-4 times. During a decade ago, that kind of ran aground. And then you have actually, while you can't do it on the border itself, I mean, you can do things in Dubai, you can do things in London. Is that something that you see, given the size of the South Asian diaspora, that there is a larger global South Asian communities that they can actually begin to connect and do things which can produce some difference? Dr. Shuli,
I think it does actually, and in this groups, they are, well, in terms of the total population in South Asia, these groups are like drop in the ocean, but they are not really small groups. And so over 100,000 membership and actively participating and knowing each other. From my side, it's like a beginning in a hopeless situation. It's not all the people who were like saw the partition. So it's the people over 80 years old are there, but at the same time, young people are there. Quite a lot of the diaspora community actually drive these discussions. So in my opinion, that could be in social media. There are lots of negativities, lots of hate speech, and also like propaganda wars going on. But this kind of group discussions, when someone puts some negativity in a post, there are more coming back there. So if one from India side or Pakistan side posts something that hurt other sides, the people from the same side also post to kind of reconciliation. So that things doesn't sustain quite a longer time. So this way of social media platform, at the same time, it's fragile, because if you can remember the Tahrir Square in 2013, the whole big platform was diminished in a moment. So that can create some sort of tensions, but I think it's a good starting, where the people in both sides at the same time, the diaspora, can work together to do some sort of positive vibes. At least a strong pressure group can start.
Okay, so thanks for that, and we have a couple of questions, but I really encourage the audience to come up with more as we have another 25 odd minutes. So we're happy to entertain quite a number of questions. There's one question, I mean, to all, any one of you, all the three panelists can address that. There was a time when, during Musharraf's period, after post-Kargil, post 2002, there was an extraordinary attempt at building a track 2 dialogue, and for a short while there was engagement between Vajpayee and Musharraf, then Manmohan Singh and Musharraf. That period of track 2 diplomacy, we saw a lot of interesting ideas come through. You see that today there's not much of that happening. There is more restrictions on visas, more restrictions on contacts. But at the same time, there is also the internet, states can't completely control the kind of interaction. So is there a creative ways in which the track 2, not just track 2, there's also track 2, that's track 3, track 1.5, I mean, you can go into that. But is there is there a alternative ways in which we can expand the space while the top level is frozen? Any one of you?
I would say that certainly there are opportunities. You've already mentioned that London or Dubai can be used as sort of potential meeting places, and this could involve people who are sort of professionals, journalists, people who have local influence but are not politicians or seeking political office as such. I think that the internet also provides, obviously, all kinds of opportunities these days for gatherings. But I suppose I'm a bit old-fashioned in my approach, but I think that person-to-person sort of interaction is often much more important. I'm not saying you can't do things, online. Of course you can. But I think just for people to interact and sit down with each other sometimes, is important in itself to help break down barriers. And that there are alternative venues, and certainly the point about the diaspora is important. I mean, it's true it was an academic group, but I mean, I was sort of very active in the 1990s with the Punjab Research Group. That launched the Journal of Punjab Studies. And this was bringing together people from Pakistan, India, diaspora. We were meeting and discussing things that might not have been possible in alternative settings. And there was a lot of involvement also from the community, particularly the Sikh community, because of where these meetings were held primarily. But so there are these opportunities for interaction. And I think that there is an appetite for this to happen, even perhaps because of the frozen nature, of a more formal political discourse between the nations.
Dr. Sethi?
Yes, no, I have to completely agree with Professor Talbot, and also on the point that there needs to be a more physical sort of physicality attached to it, of people-to-people influences. I remember growing up in the 90s where we would hear that there were theater groups that were going on exchange programs to Karachi, and the theater group was at New Delhi. I remember some of my seniors in college and my relatives are part of those groups, and they'd bring back all these ideas and this odd object from the Anarkali market in Lahore, for example. They would pick that item up for the family as if it was a sort of symbol of our home back there. Similarly, I have also heard of cross-border research projects that have taken place at LUMS back in the day. And of course, the global influence of music, as you've mentioned, Ali Sethi, in many ways, he's been the harbinger of sort of these new ways and thought processes via social media, things that were almost restricted to speak about and talk and discuss. This confluence of Hindustani classical and a very traditional Farid Koti music, which he brings to the fore. So I think with the influence he's had and the number of likes and things, the appetite certainly exists. And early career researchers like myself are ready to hop on a bus and conduct fieldwork in Umarkot or Bahawalpur. These opportunities are very, very few, but the appetite of, for example, partition homes and small town narratives. It would be so limiting if we would only look at Firozpur and Fazilka in Punjab. It would be so expansive to go just across the border and see what were some of these smaller town narratives around partition. So I believe there's massive need and scope, and in fact, who knows, influence policy towards that track 3 and track 2 diplomacy. Via these smaller projects.
Dr. Shuli, you want to add anything? Otherwise,
I actually agree with Professor Talbot and Dr. Shrishti that there is no alternative to political meeting, but there are other options that perhaps could intensify the connections. And I also agree the appetite to meet each other is so high, but there are lack opportunities. So perhaps the diaspora and like the meeting in other venues it's something as a kind of good option to start with.
There's one question on the Kartarpur Singh corridor. There's, in all the grim situation in which the two, countries were locked in a relationship, but suddenly you had this corridor, which was a long-standing demand, suddenly opened up. So what does that can we build something on that? That is the question is asking whether we can use that, at least certainly in Punjab, cross-border trade, more confidence building measure. Is that something that gives us some hope? Dr. Talbot, I mean, you see the Punjab.
I think, yes, I think that developing this linkage into economics is going to be important. And I think there would be people in Pakistan that would welcome investment, for hotels, for tourism, perhaps, and also other aspects related to this. So this doesn't just become a sort of pilgrimage and that's it, but it could be built on as something which gradually establishes sort of shared economic interest in that area of Punjab. And I think that as long as it was localized and was presented in the right way, so that it didn't sort of lead to political sort of pressures against it, that might be possible. So I think it's the beginning, it's not the end. This is the point. It is what happens thereafter that is important. That's my opinion anyway.
Would any one of you want to add? I mean, Dr. Shuli, Dr. Sethi, that you talk about the local. I mean, actually, there's one case where the local sentiment was powerful enough to force the two states to do something.
Yeah, maybe just a two-line comment on that. I think it was long coming for sure, and Punjab has really definitely paid the price in blood, quite literally. I think I'm quoting from one of the books that I was reading recently. So I think it was only about time that we needed a softer, more subtle approach to the connect that one feels, obviously religion playing such an important point. But I think there's that connectedness that a lot of the North Indian region specifically feels towards, this essentially this affective, emotive feeling of leaving something behind. I think it's a closure of some sort that one is seeking. Similarly in Rajasthan, and that's the reason why a lot of these people are visiting on pilgrimage visas, both ways really, because they seek those smaller sort of closures since the partition era. The bus service again, that was started in the time of Vajpayee ji, such a massive sort of step forward, and again a symbol of connectedness and a feeling of belonging. I think that's what we're after, rather than a more solid sort of regulatory aspect, which I hope follows through. But yes, that would be my short comment on that.
Dr. Shirley, anything on this?
I think that's a good initiative which encourages others to ask similar kind of corridors in other places. The only worrying side is the sustainability of such initiatives. It's like there were nice train services and bus services there, so it depends on how long they continue.
Yeah, I mean, there was a third question on SAARC and BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal community. Maybe I'll answer that question. I mean, SAARC, deals with the whole of the subcontinent. While we are here today really talking about India, Pakistan. We didn't talk much about India, Bangladesh, but we're really talking about India, Pakistan. So there, I think SAARC is not really. A lot of people think, look, SAARC can do something, but this is really bilateral issues. That the problem is bilateral, and if Pakistan does not want to trade with India, you can do what you want in SAARC, but that's a sovereign decision Pakistani state is taking, or it is taking a position till Kashmir issue is solved. It's not going to do certain things with India. So I think SAARC is not going to help in that process. It's really the basic dynamic between India and Pakistan has to change. And I think that's the sources of that the partition, the bitter legacies, and where both sides see the benefits of actually, of a different future. That's what we need. It's not an institutional formats that are going to fix the problem. It's useful diplomacy, but structurally, what we have is really a bilateral thing. Then there's an interesting, probably one of the last questions, which is, I still time, we can ask for one more, which is really all three of you can address this. Do we approach partition as a long process rather than an event? And should we speak in terms of stages of disruptions that have happened, especially so with regards to the impact of securitization of the border between the two Punjabs? We know, for example, till 65, 71, the border was not as militarized, as securitized. A lot has happened since then. So it's not as if everything happened at one shot. The wars of different levels, then the terrorism issue kind of made things worse. So process or a single shot events? What three of you would say?
Well, I start. Obviously, process. It's not a single event. We're still having migration, as we were talking about, as a result of partition now, 75 years later. So that the idea, that of course the problem is just partition is disregarding the multi-layered aspects which have complicated relations since 1947, but it obviously is all rooted, in that moment of time. So I think that's the way really to sort of approach this and understand it. But obviously, yes, just looking at the Punjab border, what I was talking about was a border which wouldn't be recognizable to contemporaries who have grown up in the securitized environment, but it was a reality for perhaps 2 or 3 decades after partition. So that in itself, I think, raises the question, was it inevitable that because of partition, things would take the course that they have done? And the answer is no. They're rooted in that event, but they didn't necessarily have to take, the course, negative course that they've done. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind.
Yeah, Dr. Sethi, you want to add on that?
Sure. Yes. The fact that we had such variations in the frontiers, even if we're just sort of focusing on the Western frontier for now, the variations that we've had in terms of the scales and the limits of mobility, conflict, right from Kashmir to Punjab to Rajasthan, the fact that we do have, terminologies like a dull frontier versus a dynamic frontier means that there were stages that took place across, the decades after partition, where people's flows, conflicts, as well as, governance were challenged and disrupted. So for sure, we've had scales of migration. Some have been smooth, some have been disruptive, and therefore we assume and we kind of face a partition over and over again, so to speak, for local communities. The name and the shape of communities changes. So for example, I'm referring to Pakistani Hindus today, but there were sufficient other communities and smaller groups that only got to know about the partition after the 65 war that took place, because they were so remotely placed in villages and agricultural lands, so deep into the interiors that they said, and they were just so disconnected with the politics that only after the wars were fought and the fences started coming up, they said, we better now choose sides because our ancestral land is on the other side. So definitely a processual sort of entry point into this phenomena of the partition movement, I suppose, is most appropriate. And considering the fact that it was such a massive flow and a mixed flow of people, I think we need to keep that in mind. And I think high time we start sort of mainstreaming our global South narrative of mobility and migration rooted in partition, as Professor Talbot has insisted. I think it's time, rather than borrowing from the West the conceptualizations around borders, and because each border movement is so specific and so contextual. It is, I think, it's time we start with the rootedness being emphasized even more.
Dr. Shuli, I mean.
I also agree. It's a process, or in other words, I'm a geographer, so I consider it's like an active volcano. It erupts time again and again, and we hear new different kind of things are coming up. And also, it's something like the migration that happened after the partition. It's not something, one event. It goes on. It's a process too. It's not something once people are moved and it ends. It's a continuous process as well, which we do not hear much from the migration scholarships, particularly as Dr. Trisha also mentioned. We need to scale up our experiences and findings related to this sort of movement and mobility is related to emotions and belonging. So it's surely a process.
Okay, there's one question, maybe, I don't know if you can answer that. We're beginning to run out of time. The question says, look, the partition of Pakistan was relatively peaceful in comparison to Korea and Vietnam. And is there really a comparison here? I mean, does anybody have a sense of the comparative perspective? I don't know. The question was just saying partition of Pakistan or India, but my sense is, I mean, I think the partition of India, or Bengal and Punjab, was quite sui generis and not externally imposed. It was internally demanded, and a whole lot of factors, which is very different from what happened elsewhere in the world. I mean, maybe Dr. Talbot, you want to say something on this, and then we can.
Yes, I mean, obviously, if we're looking at other partitions, they're all in their own context. There's no such thing as a single sort of model of partition. The Cold War context and the international conflict, is very different to obviously the partition in 1947. And as you were quite rightly saying, Professor Mohan, I mean, the internal dynamics, this was not something that was driven by external dynamics. It was the internal dynamics which were leading to the partition. In terms of the dislocation, obviously you could compare that with perhaps earlier partitions in the sort of Balkan areas in Greece, Turkey, in terms of displacement of population, and the fact that this was accompanied by non-state actors' violence that drove people to leave their homes. People don't easily leave their homes. They were forced into it by that degree of violence. So that is another feature, I think, if we're understanding the partition in 1947.
Dr. Sethi and Dr. Shuli, want to add just one last thought? I think after that, I'll just give some concluding remarks. Dr. Sethi?
No, maybe, yeah, I'd leave it to Dr. Shuli if there is something.
No, I actually have nothing in my mind.
Okay. So I think we're almost at the end of the time. So maybe, I mean, I'm not going to try and summarize it, but looking ahead, one of the great things of this panel was, I think, all of you were quite optimistic that it's not, I mean, if you look at the discourse at the mainstream level, at the social media or the newspapers or the TV channels, I mean, you would think it's really life has come to an end in the subcontinent, between the international relations of the subcontinent. But I would really share the optimism of at the core of all your presentations. I would say three broad things here. I think one is the change is inevitable. I mean, if there is the law of nature, the change will happen. What we've seen in the last 75 years was in the India-Pakistan case was a change that, in a negative direction, if you will, broadly, that things closed down, contacts came down, trade came down, people-to-people contact, at least the official level, all seemed to come down. So there was a negative evolution in a very macro sense. But if you look at the other side of the partition, between India and Bangladesh, the dramatic change in the last 10 years, in a way, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, India-Bangladesh border was as bad, as messy, as complicated as the India-Pakistan border today. But in the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic expansion of trade, opening up of the waterways, resumption of the railways that were there before which were shut down in 65 and 71, and that there is a lot more engagement, a number of visas that the Indian High Commission in Dhaka issues, or the number of people going up and down, some legitimately, some legally. Legality is a state provision, but there are people who want to go across and do things. So whether it's quality legal is really a legal issue, but not a meaningful issue on the ground. So my sense is, what we've seen in the case of India-Bangladesh is an example. I think there is actually things can change, provided there are conditions that produce it on the leadership. So while all of you would emphasize the local, but my reading that takes me to the second point. The high politics, the high state politics is probably as important and as interesting as, because much of the time, those of us who do these studies, really dismiss this. But I think even the study of the last 20 years of India-Pak relations shows there were frequent attempts at breaking out of the stalemate. And much of it has not come from the strategic community, has not come from the political scientists, has not come from the IR specialists who are constantly throwing recommendations for everyone. It has actually come from the political leaders. In India, whether it was Gujral or whether it was Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, or even Mr. Modi, that the political leaders have come up with ideas to break the stalemate. And similarly, on the Pakistan side, we saw General Musharraf actually create a conditions which almost we came to doing a deal on Siachen, a deal on Sir Creek, secret negotiations on Kashmir, attempted opening on trade. And it was something similar General Bajwa was trying to suggest last year, but it didn't take off. So my sense is that there is room at the top, and that we've seen in the last few years attempts. None of them fructified in a deep way, but there was efforts clearly by the two sides to break the stalemate on a number of occasions. You talked about Amritsar, Lahore. You go back and see Manmohan Singh's speech at Lahore, at Amritsar. Talking about having breakfast in Delhi, lunch in Lahore, and dinner in Kabul. The notion of actually that easy movement, and the principle on which the Kashmir issue was negotiated between India and Pakistan. We can't change borders, but we can change the nature of the borders. That as an idea that you can renegotiate the terms of the borderlands, how people move. So I think there are ideas, and that brings me to the third point. The path we traversed, but the journey we could not complete in the last 20 years, where there were multiple attempts at a peace process, actually came close to settling a number of issues. That is, the very path that the governments have walked actually have the solutions worked out. The ideas on how to resolve Siachen or Sir Creek, or for example, the World Bank supported cross-border hydrocarbon trade, cross-border grid electricity. These were not abstract, track 2 or track 3 talking, let's have this nice thing, or the candlelight people on the Vaga saying, look, this thing should happen. But it's really formal negotiations took place. How do you connect the two grades? And it's not something unique. Grids are being connected between Bangladesh and India, between Nepal and Bangladesh. So things are happening within the region itself to transcend some of those. For example, the pipeline. I mean, we talked about so many pipelines in South Asia, but the easiest pipeline is from Jalandhar to Lahore. Jalandhar has a huge refinery. Lahore needs petroleum products, and they can get a lot from India. And in fact, there was a 2012, 2013, there was a serious negotiation to get it done, but unfortunately, it didn't work out. So my sense is that the Modi government too, I mean, while the current situation looks difficult, it was the Modi government that opened the Kartar Singh corridor when it saw the opportunity. Modi traveled to Lahore on a short notice, to wish Mr. Nawaz Sharif. I don't know that that was almost on an hour's notice that he landed there. And there were talks between the two sides, which talked about religious tourism. One of the things we talk about is visas and religious tourism. So there are, even in the current seemingly hopeless situation, there is room, I think. And I think that's where the task of our academics and policy researchers is really to point the way to making that progress. And I think that if we can do that, to create an atmosphere of possibilities that exist today between India and Pakistan, to end that stalemate while we're breaking it in the eastern subcontinent. The partition's rupture is partly overcome. There are a whole lot of other issues, but at least some major issues have been overcome. And I think something similar can be done on the Western, on the India-Pakistan. And if you get it there, the issues are not very different between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Similar lines drawn, similar people across the boundaries, and a whole lot of issues are there. So my sense is South Asia in that sense is ripe for some creative thinking, and hopefully the scholarship will provide some light of which the direction to go. So I thank the three speakers. Please join me in putting our hands together, and let me also thank the ISAS for organizing these roundtables. And we'll stop here. Hand over to Vinny. The floor is back to you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank all the speakers and the chair for such an insightful discussion. I'd also like to thank all the participants for being a part of this session. Please do join us for the next roundtable session titled Integrating New States that will commence shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.